My name is Casey Baker. I am a software engineering manager at NextGear Capital, which is a subsidiary of Cox Automotive. We're located over in Carmel. I've managed a couple of teams for about 2 years, and we began the journey to AWS about 2 years ago, right about the time I took over managing the teams. I want to share a little bit about our journey with you this morning, how we did that, and how we made some of the decisions we did. And mostly that centers around the AWS WellArchitected Framework. So I'm going to cover that with you. There's a lot of great resources online and other things that you can look at, starting right with a Google search of AWS WellArchitected Framework. So the AWS themselves have put together great white papers and great information about how the well-architected framework should work, the best practices you should consider, and I'm going to review them here, but there's lots of great information out there, so I hope you'll take a look at it. Talk to you a little bit about me. 10 years of software development experience. I started out as a dev and I built things for a long time. Now I work with others and help them to figure out what and how to build it. I really didn't have a lot of cloud experience when we started this process. I figured things out as I went, and really the team figured things out and kind of drugged me along with them. So happy to answer any questions you guys might have. This deck will be available later. My email address is there, MySpace for anybody that's kind of on the cutting edge, but also LinkedIn and Twitter. I'm a Twitter disappointment, just spoiler alert there. This talk is really geared to either business people or maybe beginner to intermediate developers. We're going to talk at a high level about how the AWS WellArchitected Framework works. You don't have to have any cloud experience or really any development experience to, I think, make use of what we talk about here. It is AWS-centric, but hopefully it's generally applicable. AWS has done a really good job of telling you how you should do things and then suggesting how you could do things with them. And so we're going to focus on the how and talk a little bit about how you might do it with AWS. And then we'll figure out kind of what the implications are for you. And the way I've kind of laid the talk out is really to review our applications, what we were trying to move, the choices we had to make moving to the cloud, why we took the approaches we did, and then again, that review of the AWS WellArchitected Framework. I'm trying to keep the boredom level to moderate or lower, so it's early in the morning. I don't want anybody to fall asleep. And I also have tried to provide some artwork through the presentation. So I start with my own work here, a word cloud of cloud words. I think sometimes it can be confusing to talk about the cloud and what's going on and everything as a service and what does a platform mean? What do we need to do to architect this thing well? So it can be overwhelming. That's how I felt 2 years ago. This is what I saw when I did my first baby Google search on how do we move to the cloud. I got a lot of white papers that I didn't really understand. And so a lot of my experience of my journey over the last 2 years has been around unscrambling this word scramble, if you will. So let's start off talking a little bit about our project and what we do and why we do it. I don't want to spend too much time on this because A, I'll probably get in trouble with my employer if I tell you too much, but B, you're probably much more interested in your project, so I want to get to things that are more applicable to you. But this is the environment that we occupy and what we're trying to figure out. My company builds title management software for a very large auto auction company called Mannheim Auto Auctions. Here in town, Odessa's the big player, but Mannheim is the big player nationally. We have 68 US locations, and our goal is that anyone can drop off a title at any location, and that title will be processed regardless of where the car sold, regardless of what's happening in that process. This is part of a very large rollout we've been involved in for the last 4 years. And really over the last 2, like I said, we've been moving to the cloud, but we built this app on-prem in the 2 years prior to that. It is a mission-critical application. If that application goes down today on the sale day of our largest customer, Mannheim, Pennsylvania, the company will lose $1 million. And it's not unusual that that happens, that we have these kind of mission-critical moments through our week. Tuesdays, Thursdays, Fridays. Any minute that this application is down is a minute that a dealer is standing at the auction yelling at a title clerk. And then I get a phone call I don't want to get. In terms of our tech stack, we use Java, we use Postgres, we use Angular. We've got some file storage considerations to think about. For example, when we actually intake a title, we scan it in. So there's an FTP process where that digital scan actually has to land somewhere. Today it lands in AWS, but 2 years ago, it landed in the Expedient Data Center in Carmel. We also have to mount Windows machines to that to do OCR work to that. We have some caching considerations. How do we manage our services and our state across different containers of our running application? And then, of course, networking and security. You can't get to our application, and that's by design, but if you're at a Mannheim Auto Auction and you're a title clerk, you can. So how do we preserve that as we think about moving to the cloud? Yeah, sure. You can, yeah, let's try that. Let's try asking questions. What's up? Absolutely, yeah. This is really both. This is where we started on, and this is really where we ended up as well. So these considerations were things that we considered 2 years ago, but they're still things that we're dealing with today. Absolutely. So this is a very quick architecture diagram, obviously a little too small to read. It's mostly to let you know that we're kind of a complicated application. There are a lot of different moving parts. Typically, if you see stacks of boxes, you see containerized applications deployed in parallel, where we have to deal with load balancing and other questions. You see a few databases up there. You see a firewall that's marked with that heavy black line at the top. We have to deal with systems inside and outside that firewall. And it's a complicated system. It's also not a system that we can flip a switch and move in one day. So some of the considerations that we thought about were, how do you make that move maybe over time? And how do you think about that? And what sort of framework can you use to do it? So as we began our journey, we really talked about what we called 5 highways to the cloud. And I'm pretty sure we borrowed that term from Gartner. But the idea is that there's 5 ways to do this, if you want to abstract it out to a certain level. You can rehost your application, you can refactor it, you can revise it, you can rebuild it, or you can replace it. And let's talk about each in a little bit of detail. So you can rehost your application, and that's exactly what it sounds like. You take your application from your data center and you drop it onto somebody else's data center. This is what we might call infrastructure as a service. The idea being, I don't want to manage a server, I don't want to pay for rack space, I don't want to send a guy over there when there's a problem, and I don't really want to deal with the low-level headache of running a data center. But I'm not really ready to change my application to be cloud first or cloud forward or cloud friendly. Sometimes you hear this called lift and shift. The pros and cons of all of these are going to be pretty obvious, but I'll cover them really quickly. The cost, speed, and low-risk nature of moving an application is very attractive, especially when you talk about timelines and budgets. But the cons are that it fails to leverage the benefits of the cloud. You really are just changing your internet service provider. And again, advantages to that, but a lot of disadvantages. So the next step along that continuum might be more of a refactor. Maybe we want to do a platform as a service. This is how this is kind of considered in the industry. The pros here, lower risk, right? We're taking some risk, but we're not rebuilding our application to be cloud first or cloud forward. There is some risk, though. That transition risk exists, and it's possible that you're missing capabilities. We could revise the application. We could modify or extend our code base. The pros here, hey, we get cloud stuff. This is the first spot where we really can take advantage of some of what Azure or AWS, in our case, offers us. But the cons, again, that transition risk, that transitive risk, and there's some upfront development that we really need to stop and consider in that moment. And this is where things start to cost a little bit more, take a little bit more time, and you have to go through a selling process with your business partners. A little bit further along that process is the notion of rebuilding your application. This is where we're going to take it and throw it away and re-architect it to be cloud first. There were a lot of folks in our organization, full transparency, that thought this is a great idea. But there's a talk later today about avoiding shiny objects, and there's a lesson to be learned here around that. Sometimes it sounds great to just rebuild it, but obviously that's incredibly expensive in many cases, and it's generally pretty slow. The pro, of course, though, is you can leverage your application as if you built it from scratch to work in AWS. I promised some artwork. If you're not familiar with classic programmer paintings, it's a great Tumblr to follow. This is called The Allure of a Full Rewrite, and I thought it was appropriate here. The last of the 5 highways, if you will, is to replace the application. In this particular case, this is a full software as a service implementation. Basically, I'm going to go out and find something that can do what I need to do, and I'm just going to pay somebody else to handle it for me. Pros and cons, again, pretty obvious here. It can save you a lot of money. You don't have to have developers, for example. That's nice. except for me and Calvin and others in the room who might have that role. But of course, the con is you really lose control of what your application can do, and you lose functionality. So there's a real fit-to-purpose challenge. All of those things have costs that are never really clear at the beginning of the project, and they're worth considering. I wanted to summarize those 5 highways, and I found this graphic on the BMC blog that I thought was useful. It talks a little bit about on-premise, but infrastructure as a service is kind of that first option that we talked about. Platform as a service is a little bit further along the spectrum, and then software as a service is really that notion of throwing it away and replacing it with a cloud-friendly idea. And as you can see, it's really how much of the stack do you want to maintain? One of my favorite jokes around moving to the cloud is that there is no such thing as serverless architecture. The server just becomes somebody else's problem. And so in this particular case, we can see that the further we go along that path, the more likely it is that something becomes somebody else's problem. I don't have to worry about networking and storage if I rehost my application, if I just move it into the cloud, but I probably still need to install Windows or install Linux and run it myself. If I go with a platform as a service, where I'm really just leveraging everything that AWS and Azure offers, I can do less of that, but that comes at a cost, namely I have to refactor my application. And software as a service, I have no management responsibilities, but I better make sure that whatever I'm doing meets my business need. So how do you choose your path? How do you pick which path is the right one? There's some obvious considerations here, cost and budget and time being the big ones. To me, cost, time and budget are the same thing because time does always equal money when these projects come up. How long do you have? How much effort are you willing to spend? And how much money do you have to spend on it? There are some less obvious considerations, road bumps, whatever you want to call them, that you really should stop and think about when you're trying to make the decision about which of these paths you want to choose. And for me, they come down to these 5. First of all, how risk tolerant is your organization? Can you really stomach the notion of taking, say, a mission-critical app like the Vault title management application that my teams work on? Can you really stomach the idea of rebuilding it from scratch and introducing all of the risk that we might miss some business requirement from 4 years ago that nobody wrote down? How bought in are your stakeholders? There's typically not a lot of appetite for spending money on things that already work. So if I go to my business stakeholders and I say, I'm going to deliver to you the exact same thing you have now, but I will be happier, that's not a great reason to do it. So I need to get stakeholder buy-in. I need to think about how my stakeholders are going to think about this. I need to help them understand the cost and the performance considerations. DevOps buy-in and philosophy, this one was very much a sticky subject at NextGear. We have a very mature DevOps organization that really takes pride in what they do, but they sit separately from the development teams. So to share a personal story and one that's a little embarrassing, when I first set out the timeline for how we were going to move to the cloud, I said, we're going to move the eventing layer, the part where we talk to other systems, call it the integrations layer for the purposes of this talk. We're going to move it in Q3. And it turned out the DevOps leader was just laughing. He was sitting in the back of the room laughing at me. And I didn't know this, but somebody told me about it later. And I went to talk to him and I said, hey, what's up? I hear you don't find that to be credible. And he said, you can't do anything without my teams. And he wasn't being confrontational. He was just reminding me that I might ship my application, I might build my application, but I don't run my application. He does. And so without his team's support, without capacity, we can't do anything. And I hadn't bothered to ask him that question. So because I didn't think through that DevOps buy-in piece, it cost us a quarter of development work. And it's something that I would really encourage anyone that's beginning this journey to think about. Technical debt tolerance is a big one. How willing are you to put things aside and come back to them later? And then the long-term considerations. What do you really want to get out of your cloud move? That's important as well. Our most important considerations I've kind of previewed for you. Budget and time always are big deals. DevOps buy-in was a big deal for us. What we ultimately chose to do was to refactor and revise. We wanted to evaluate our platform, figure out where we could get some quick wins by making a move, evaluate the skill sets we had in-house and figure out who can we talk to, what do they bring to the table, what expertise can we do to get this right up front, but really to commit to getting it right eventually. And I want to take a moment and talk about that eventually piece. So I'm going to call this an Agile aside. You can't go to any conference and not mention Agile, so I'm going to get it out of the way early today. It started with an argument between me and my boss, which was kind of an odd argument to include here, but it really makes sense in the context of what we did. What does it mean to be agile? Well, for me, it means delivering meaningful value quickly at the expense of trying to deliver all the value up front. Can I give you something you want now and make you a little bit happy, or do you want all of it now, which you can't have, we all know that, right? But is that really, where do you sit on that spectrum? Are you willing to wait for all of it and realize that your needs may change, or do you want a little bit now, and then we'll figure out how that works? The analogy that I used was, if I need a table and I have a block of wood sitting in front of me, but I really know that what I'm gonna need eventually is a metal table that can support a lot of weight, should I use that block of wood as my table? Well, I would say yes. It's right here, I've got it. I don't have to go to IKEA and get a metal table. I'm just ready to go. If I need that metal table later, I can go get it later. But today, I've got a table right in front of me, so why don't we use the resources we have? So the operational key for us ended up being, you don't have to get it right the first time, you have to get it right enough the first time. And I think that's a really important distinction. Sometimes it's really compelling to boil the ocean a little bit. Oh, we got to move to the cloud. We got to use AWS this and AWS that. We got to go back to that word cloud you saw earlier on. I don't think that's how you move successfully to the cloud. And I think our organization over time has come to agree with me on that. But how do you know if you got it right enough? I keep talking about getting it right enough. How do you know? Well, one way to know is to rely on the experts. And that's, of course, what you've all come to hear a little bit about, and that's the AWS WellArchitected Framework. So I want to start by saying what the AWS WellArchitected Framework is and what it is not. What it is a set of guidelines to evaluate your migration. It's also a set of patterns that you can use. And finally, it's an evaluative tool to figure out what you're doing and whether you're doing things in a way that makes sense, is sustainable, and is taking the right things into consideration. What it is not is a prescriptive approach. And it's funny because if you read the initial white paper about the AWS WellArchitected Framework, which in full disclosure I borrow liberally from for the rest of our presentation here, you hear it talk about the fact that it's not going to tell you what to do. If you want to read further white papers that AWS provides, they'll be happy to tell you what to do or how to do it. But the well-architected framework itself is not a prescriptive approach. It's also not a list of commandments. It's really about fostering a conversation and a discussion about how you might build things and the choices you might make. So it relies on some pillars, and there are 5 of them. And I'm going to try to go into a little bit of detail over the time I have left, talking about each of these pillars. And they're probably what we'd come up with if we sat at a table and thought about what's important about our cloud move and our operation in the cloud. And I kind of think they're in the order that you should think about them. So I'm going to take them in that order. Operational excellence, security, reliability, performance efficiency, and cost optimization. Let's talk about operational excellence first. Operational excellence is the ability to run and monitor systems to deliver business value and to continually improve supporting processes and procedures. I think that continually improve part is really important. So I want to pause here a minute and just note that continual improvement is such a critical piece of this. Going back to what I said earlier, you don't need to get it right the first time. You don't need to boil the ocean. You just need to get it right enough. But it's really critical if you're getting it right enough that you're thinking through where you might go after that. Because our ultimate goal is to get better and better and better. Again, going back to that agile principle, that agile mindset, let's inspect, let's adapt. So continual improvement is an important part of operational excellence, and Amazon actually makes it one of the best practices that they suggest you talk about. We'll talk about that in a minute. So what does operational excellence mean? Well, it means these things. First of all, you should perform your operations as code. Don't try to build a server in AWS. You can do it, absolutely. You can go out there and you can't control the virtualization, you can't control the actual hardware, but you can install Windows or Linux and run from the ground up. That's fine, but maybe if you really want to do that, what you should do is you should think about how you might automate that process. Instead of building one Linux box, I want to describe a way in which I can build Linux boxes. So today when I need one, I push a button, I get a box. Tomorrow, when I need 10, I push the button and I get 10 of them. I didn't have to do any extra work. So I want to perform my operations as code because that makes them repeatable. It also means you can track changes over time, which is going to come up as we talk about resilience and security. Annotated documentation is important. This is the notion that you can very easily include in those operations as code things that generate documentation. If there are developers in the room, I suspect if I ask how many of you like to write documentation, I would see no hands go up. And it's not because I put you to sleep. It's because nobody likes to write documentation. I love documentation and I hate writing it. I just like when other people write it and I can read it because then it's helpful. But it's not helpful for me to have to do it, right? So nobody wants to write documentation. How about we get it for free in the form of annotated documentation? Frequent small reversible changes are really important. This is the notion that we should experiment, try something. If it works, great. If it doesn't, maybe figure things out. Refine ops procedures frequently. I told you that continual improvement would come up again, and here it is. My favorite, though, are these last two. You should anticipate that things will not go well, and you should learn from things when they don't go well. Anticipate your failure and learn from your failure. Failure is a good thing. Hopefully at this point, we have a sense of that and we know it. So let's talk about best practice areas. As we talk about how we might handle operational excellence, think about preparing to do it, think about operating, and think about how to evolve. So as we prepare, engage the entire business, understand your requirements. Experiment and design your system based on those needs. What we did, and I'm going to talk about the lessons we learned here in a minute, but we stopped and said, what do we really need to be successful in AWS? We don't need to re-architect our application, but we need to change pieces of it. So for example, instead of using RabbitMQ as our messaging system, that doesn't work really well for us in AWS, so we're using SNS and SQS instead. And we'll talk a little bit about SNS in a bit. Operating and evolve, exactly what they sound like. Operating is focusing on outcomes, being automated, and making troubleshooting easy. What are you doing day to day? And as you evolve, that's that point of coming back and aligning to the notion that you want to get better. Here are some helpful tools. I'm going to skip over those for the sake of time. But what did we learn, or what should we have learned in that process? Well, first of all, you need careful alignment between dev and ops. If they're integrated into one team, you get that. If they're not, make sure you get it. It's really important. Metrics and monitoring is important, but how much is enough? That's a battle we're still fighting, trying to figure out how good is good enough to get that done. We know we need it, but how much do we need? Embrace failure and learn from it. Build it manually first. That's a huge lesson that we learned. It was really important for us to understand we need to build it, and then we can figure out how to abstract it into code. And then ongoing efforts are really essential. So moving on to the second pillar, security. This is the ability to protect information systems and assets while delivering business value through risk assessments and mitigation strategies. How do we do it? You implement a strong security foundation. You have security at all layers, and you really prepare for security events. Again, think about failure, assess failure, talk about it. Here are some best practices there. Identity and access management. Some of this you really get for free in AWS. They have a great IAM console where you can say, this person can do these things, or this role can do these things. It really just does it for you. And it's been a great lesson that we've learned that we don't have to manage that anymore, beyond managing our own Active Directory, for example. Detective controls, this is really about inventorying and auditing what's out there. Infrastructure protection. Make sure to harden the machines you have and build that into your infrastructure as code. So when I say AMI up here, I'm referring to Amazon machine images, which come up on a future slide. Data protection, make sure you manage your security keys, and you get resiliency here for free, because by managing those security keys, if something fails, you can go out and get a new key, and you've already got a key management system in place. And then incident response. Make sure to log and event things out when things go wrong. And take advantage of clean room forensics. In our first step, talking about operational excellence, we talked about how easy it was to spin things up. Spin up an environment to figure out what went wrong with security. And you've got, if you will, a clean room. I really liked that term. Here are some helpful tools there. There's a lot of acronyms here. Again, I won't spend a ton of time on this slide, but some things I will point out are hardened AMIs, as I mentioned earlier. Identity and access management is, again, Amazon's tool to do that. And then AWS's web application firewall can help you in this space as well. What did we learn? Well, we had a lot of help. So I don't know that I learned a ton here, but I got a lot of knowledge here. And I got that from the people around us in our org. For example, the Cox Auto Cloud Business Office thinks about security. So they put together a giant checklist and some scans that we needed to run, and they told us what we needed to do better or worse. Similarly, we had an information security shared service that actually operated across the business. They could share insights from what others did. You may not have that in your business, but network in the community, figure out the people here today who care about information security and ask them those questions. Cox Auto actually came up with the concept of a level 2 account, which is this notion that, in essence, you can only access secure accounts if you have certain access privileges. And really, a level 2 account, you can't access at all, not directly, unless there's a real problem. So level 2 accounts were something that helped us as well. There's also a discipline of the migration that exposes potential weaknesses to us. We had to argue about what data even needed to be protected and how we do it. And then how good is good enough? So covering the next one, I have reliability. And this is the ability of the system to recover from infrastructure or service disruptions and mitigate them as necessary. So mitigate disruptions such as misconfigurations and transient network issues. Stuff happens, right? We know this. So the idea behind reliability, you could call this resiliency, and I actually think that would be a better word, but how can you make sure that your system can handle that? So my insights here, make sure you have your recovery procedures in place and that you test them. Make sure you think about automatic failure recovery. So for example, we have a system that goes out and just checks that all of our services are up and available, and if they aren't, they restart the service. If our services are truly stateless, that's easy to do. And so we put some monitors around there. We are able to scale horizontally, meaning we have lots of containers that sit in parallel to one another. When one fails, we have 8 others. Stop guessing at capacity. Use AWS's tools. It gives you that information. You can begin to think about how much of something you really need. And then manage your change in automation. This goes back to that first step. Infrastructure as code, change it as necessary. Helpful tools, again, we can talk about those a little bit. Trusted advisor is the big one that shows up in my head here. But what did we learn, or what should we have learned? Well, first of all, we learned what we don't know. We didn't know how to measure demand. We didn't know how to talk about the business needs for recovery. I asked the question, what is our recovery time if the vault goes down? The answer is we needed it yesterday. And so we had to talk about, well, what does yesterday mean? Is that 5 minutes? Is that 10 minutes? We know you can't have it right this minute. So what are we going to do? Networking is hard. Define your success criteria early. These last two I'm not going to spend a ton of time on, mostly because I'm running out of time, but also because they're kind of AWS's main selling point. And they are performance, which is the ability to use computing resources effectively to meet system requirements. That's a key one. I'm going to skip to our insights. What we should have learned. Well, first of all, it's hard to let go of old ways of doing things and let Amazon manage things for you. As a service means somebody loses a job because that service used to be provided by a guy at a keyboard. What you got you here, though, won't get you there. So you need to think about how to change those things and why to change them. But you don't have to go there right now. And preparation, again, is really key here. The final one is cost optimization. And again, this is a big selling point of Amazon. The idea here is that you can deliver value at the lowest price point. The key insight for us here is to adopt a consumption model. Don't pay for what you have, pay for what you need and what you use. But use what you have or don't have it. That's a key insight for us. You also have to keep learning. And you have to make sure you don't weaponize your metrics. If my team uses a bunch of stuff, if I've not put good guardrails in, that's a problem. But generally speaking, that's going to happen sometimes. So I've got just a couple of slides left, and really it's about how you actually operationalize this. And this is the AWS WellArchitected Framework review. This is based on Amazon's own review process. It's blameless. It's a conversation, not an audit. And it's really designed to measure and ensure success. It is really not designed to say, you didn't do it right. It's only designed to say, how can we do it better? Well, it's an iterative process. It should be appropriately lightweight. You can do a well-architected framework review in an hour. Amazon provides tools on their website to do it, but sometimes it can take a little longer, especially if you've not done it before, but it's hours, not days. It should be everybody because everyone is responsible for an effective migration and good architecture. And you should align those reviews to key milestones. Make sure to avoid one-way doors. If you need to make a choice, have a review. Take an hour and sit in a room and talk about it. Do it once more before you go live, and then do it after you go live. How do you do it? Well, do it in person. have some whiteboards, print out your diagrams or design notes, make sure to have a parking lot that you can say, well, I don't know the answer to that question, but I'll come back. And incorporate the priorities of your organization into that review, but only if appropriate. So don't bring the cost considerations or the budget or the timeline in. Let developers be developers and develop. And bring those priorities in only if they align to the purpose of the review. Sometimes you'll hear some objections. We're too busy, we don't have time. We don't have time to do anything with the results. Or we don't want to reveal the secrets of our implementation. The answers here are probably pretty obvious to overcome, but you're never too busy to do it right. Even if you don't have time to review the results or take action on them now, you should at least know where the bodies are buried. And you're not going to reveal any secrets of your implementation. This is really questions like, have you considered security? And what strategies are you going to take to make sure that our data stays secure? Those are the kinds of questions you're going to ask, not show us the data flows through your application and show us your architecture. There are some helpful resources that I want to point out. The AWS WellArchitected website is a big one. Again, you'll find almost everything I talked about in some way, shape, or form there. There are some great white papers that are available via that link. This presentation's on SlideShare. Mary Beth tells me it will also be on the website, so look for it there. And I really just wanted to point out my team, who did a really good job over the last 2 years of helping me to understand how to do this and how to do it well. Troy Larson works for AWS. He's a great resource if you have a chance to work with him. I understand he's a consultant for hire, though he's worked with Cox Auto for the last year or so. He's out there and available. The other folks listed, Josh, Ambika, Robert, and Brett, are part of our team and have helped us to make that move over the last couple of years. So thanks to them as well. I think I have elapsed time. Perfect. Thank you so much for your time this morning and your attention. I really appreciate it. I hope everybody has a great day, and I'm looking forward to learning with you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.